Welcome to Daily Brief YouTube channel. The 8th day of the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine started with the sounds of air bombardments carried out by the Russian army in many city centers. The fact that 80% of the Russian army announced by the USA is within the borders of Ukraine did not change the unplanned delays and failure of Russia in the ground operation. Having hit critical defense points in the first 2 days, Russia was expected to seize Kiev within 24 hours afterwards. But when we look today, on the 8th day of the war, the Russian army still did not enter Kiev and some areas captured by the Russian forces were taken back by the Ukrainian armed forces. There are conflicts in many Ukrainian cities, and contrary to expectations, the conflicts turn into guerrilla warfare. Sirens did not go silent throughout the day in Kiev and bombs fell on many points of the capital. While a new ground operation is expected with the arrival of the kilometer-long convoy moving to Kiev, Russia seems to want to break all the resistance of the Ukrainian armed forces before that. Realizing that it is very difficult to besiege Kiev from the west, the Russian troops will unite with the separatists in the Donbas region and surround Kiev from the east. Russian forces in southern Ukraine are making gains as the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine escalates. A day after taking control of the first major Ukrainian city, Russian forces on Thursday besieged urban areas across the country in a stoning attack that broke into civilian neighborhoods, beating it with heavier artillery and driving essential services to rubble. The attacks deepened a humanitarian crisis that caused 1 million people to flee the country and another million to flee their homes to Ukrainian cities far from the war. Today, the second round of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia ended negatively. However, Russia's acceptance of the decision to open a humanitarian corridor for civilians was one of the pleasing developments of the day. The agreement includes a possible temporary ceasefire during the evacuations, and it was agreed to open a corridor for the evacuation of civilians. On the first day of the war, troops entering the Ukrainian border from the northwest captured the former Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and Russian forces began to advance towards Kiev. Special forces and airborne troops were approaching the capital at the end of the day, but were met with stiff defense in Kiev by Ukrainian forces. In the following days, the Russian army captured the town of Makariv, west of Kiev. The statement made today announced that the armed forces of Ukraine again took control of Makariv. In the report shared by the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, Valery Zaluzhny, Prince Roman stated that the 14th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade and the 95th Separate Attack Force Brigade liberated Makariv in the Kyiv region, and the region was again under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. The rapid loss of the city of Kherson in the south of the country today has raised fears that other cities may soon follow, as the Russian bombardment puts pressure on the people to surrender. Russian forces seem to be making their biggest gains in the south, where they nearly surrounded 2 strategic cities to seize Ukraine's entire Black Sea coast and potentially cut the country off from world shipping. Russian troops besieged the port city of Mariupol, a key point between the Russian border and the Russian-controlled Crimean Peninsula, and were advancing further west into Mykolaiv, just north of Kherson. Military experts say capturing these cities will fulfill Moscow's strategic goal of cutting off Ukrainian forces fighting Russia-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine from the rest of the country. At the same time, according to the estimates made by the Ukrainian armed forces, since the first day of its attack on Ukraine, Russia has lost 217 tanks, 90 artillery guns, 42 multiple launch rocket systems, 30 warplanes, 31 helicopters, 900 armored personnel carriers and 374 vehicles. On the other hand, the Russian Federation claims that the information released by Ukraine is not correct. According to the Russian Federation, 2,000 Russian troops were lost, and the loss of armored vehicles and aircraft is much lower than what Ukraine announced. Allegedly, Russian troops are bombing and destroying the infrastructures of Kyiv and nearby towns. It is stated that Russia has bombed the residential areas of Ukrainian cities and villages with artillery, multiple rocket launchers and ballistic missiles. Unfortunately, concrete solutions cannot be produced in the face of such severe attacks on civilian areas. There are serious diplomatic and military obstacles in front of Ukraine that hinder the aid of troops and advanced weapons, tanks and aircraft. Most importantly, it means that Ukraine is not a member of NATO and the EU, and that any North Atlantic Alliance country cannot send troops, tanks, warplanes or air defense systems to Ukraine. On the other hand, the decision of the USA to take a firm stance against these moves of Russia seems appropriate. In fact, the USA and UK are the guarantors of the political and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and this was confirmed by the Budapest Security Assurance Memorandum signed by Washington, London and Moscow 28 years ago. However, in the 1994 agreement, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in order to guarantee that it would not be invaded by Russia. But look what's going on today. A serious military shipment is being carried out in Eastern Europe with the North Atlantic Alliance. It seems that the North Atlantic Alliance still does not intervene in Ukraine. According to NATO's Article 5, this is not possible at the moment. However, it is claimed that moves contrary to international law were made in the region. Russia's threat not only to Ukraine but also to Eastern Europe seems to be forcing the Baltic states, Europe, the North Atlantic Alliance and the United States to increase their contingency plans. One of the main aims of the North Atlantic Alliance and the USA with the recent shipments is thought to be to sharply strengthen its deterrence in the eastern flank member states so that Russia does not test its collective defense commitment. U.S. President Joe Biden stated that he is pleased with the unity within the North Atlantic Alliance and that the environment he wants to create within the alliance is to act as one. Earlier on Thursday, General Mark A. Milley, top military advisor to President Biden, said the Ukrainian military is conducting a highly effective and moving defense on its territory, using its innate knowledge to thwart Russian forces on multiple fronts. Although the strategic city of Kherson fell into Russian hands on Wednesday, officials said Ukrainian forces are waging battles up and down Russian lines with what they describe as the skill and ingenuity that can trip Russian troops for weeks or months. The Chief of Staff, General Milley, said the tactics employed by the Ukrainian troops included using mobile weapon systems to drive the Russians mad wherever possible. He said that Ukrainian troops fought with extraordinary skill and courage against the Russian forces. Fighting the Ukrainian people has become the eyes and ears of the world, said General Milley, as he stood up to an invading country that eclipsed their own and showed they were ready to die to protect it. Public comments to journalists traveling with him to meet with European officials at NATO are the first time General Milley has made since Russian President Vladimir Putin began his brutal efforts to seize Ukraine and overthrow the government of democratically elected President Volodymyr Zelensky. Was the comment. General Milley met with NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg in Brussels before traveling to Stuttgart, Germany, to meet with America's European Command. Mr. Stoltenberg said the Ukrainian military, supported by arms shipments from NATO countries in recent days, has performed better and has shown more resilience than most experts expected, and certainly more than Russia expected. One of the hottest developments of the day was the telephone conversation between Russian President Vladimir Putin and French President Emmanuel Macron. During the 90-minute phone call, very critical messages about the region emerged. He gave little hope that the war in Ukraine would subside at any time, and the Kremlin said it had no intention of backing out from a war going according to plan, and a warning from the French presidency that Mr. Putin seems determined to invade the entire country. A senior official in the French presidency briefed reporters on the 90-minute meeting between the two leaders, and Mr. Macron said, "Our analysis of military operations is that Russia's ambition is to take control of all of Ukraine." Pessimism after the call. Nothing is certain about the success of Russia's operations, but speaking on condition of anonymity in line with French government practices, "We have to wait for the worst to come," said the official. "There is nothing in what President Putin has said to comfort us," the official said. The call, which the French presidency says came at the Kremlin's request, was the third debate between the two leaders since the start of the war. Mr. Macron, who is expected to announce his recandidacy later on Thursday in April, has positioned himself at the center of diplomacy in Europe, polishing his reputation in France and abroad as an interlocutor with Mr. Putin. But while the French presidency has stressed that France will keep its diplomatic lines with Russia as open as necessary, including by organizing the passage of humanitarian aid, the ensuing telephone conversations have shown the limits of Mr. Macron's access to Mr. Putin. The French official gave a harsh assessment of Putin's determination to continue the conflict, saying he perceived the Russian leader's repeated long list of complaints and humiliations from Western countries that forced him to take action. The official said Putin also repeated demands from the Ukrainian government and other European countries that he had already found unacceptable. The official said Macron told Putin that he had made a serious mistake, and that he was deceiving himself, and looking for excuses, by claiming that the Kyiv government was run by the Nazis. Mr. Macron warned that Russia would pay a heavy price, leaving the country weakened, isolated and under sanctions for a very long time. In its own reading of the call, the Kremlin said that Putin had told his French counterpart that his main goal was the disarmament and neutral status of Ukraine. The Kremlin said these goals will be achieved no matter what. Putin also denied that Russian forces attacked civilians, dismissing them as elements of an anti-Russian disinformation campaign.